Welcome to this roundtable discussion where we sit down with our speakers and go into talks in more detail. Our talk that we're going into more detail today is all about Mary the First, and with our speaker Johanna Strong. So, hi Johanna, hope you are doing well.
Yeah, doing okay. It's a rainy, gross day in Winchester, but that's okay.
It's raining here. I think it's raining everywhere. Though I've heard there's been snow in Essex, I've heard. But down here it's rain. So yeah, it's snow. I'm sure that when I talk to people later they'll talk about snow, so I won't talk about it just yet. But with us, we've got quite a big team today to talk about this topic. That's actually 6 of us, which is our biggest roundtable discussion, which works because this was our record breaker talk as well. This is a talk with most attended people live, so it makes sense to have our record breaking roundtable as well. So with us today we have James. Hi James, how are you doing?
Hi Michael, yeah, I'm doing good. I went out for a walk in the snow, sludgy, horrible mess. So yeah, I've recovered, I've dried myself off, I'm feeling good.
And what drew you to this topic as an historian?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm fascinated, as many of you know, by memory and, why we remember the things we remember and such like. And really sort of like, I mean, I'm out my depth here. I'm a World War historian, the First, Second World War. I'm 20th century. At best, I go back to the Napoleonic War, American Revolution. So I'm hundreds of years out of my comfort zone at the moment. But it is really fascinating. And I have to say, Joe, one of the things I really loved about your talk is your passion and energy giving it. And just, it's such an exciting topic. And I want to know more about why is she forgotten, why, and I mean, I'll ask this with my question, but certainly at school, the tutors is always about Henry VIII and about Elizabeth I, and there's so much forgotten. It's like, actually, this is really interesting. Why is this happening? Why do we choose this for them,
I think Joe, you're converting James into an early modern historian, so thumbs up. Also with us today we have Amy. So hi Amy, how are you doing?
Cool, I'm good, thank you. We got actual snow this week, so we have built a snowman that looks more like a moomin. But yeah, we've had fun.
Jealous much. I'm very jealous because all I see is just rain, and I had a power cut as well a couple of days ago. So which I lost the whole day, which was great. So what drew you though to this topic?
So Joe and I both do early modern Catholic queens as our PhD topics, and we spend lots of time, before COVID, we got to go around Westminster together and go to the BL together and things. So yeah, I loved Joe's talk and been to lots of Joe's talks and things before. So yeah, looking forward to having a chat about it.
Me as well. I'm looking forward to this again. Someone who, this is bit before me, but at the same time, it's so fascinating. So I'm looking forward to learning more about all this. Also with us, we've got Julie. Hi, Julie. How are you doing?
Yeah, hi, Michael. Oh, yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
And what drew you to this topic about Mary the First?
Well, of course, as children, we were all fascinated by the Tudor story. Dysfunctional family par excellence. But I'm particularly interested in Mary because we tend to forget for some time she was an Essex girl. She had a palace at Bewley, which is now Newhall School in Boreham. And I went to a time team dig there some years ago, got a cuddle with Jonathan Foyle, which was very exciting. So I was fascinated by the fact that she started out as a beloved child, a princess, this child of a love match between Henry and Catherine, and how her fortunes were so dependent on his love life, and as she went through the turmoils of the different stepmothers that she had, she was in favour, out of favour, and I just find this whole thing absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, incredible, isn't it? Really, as you said, the Tudors are a very interesting family, and that definitely captured the imagination of many people, and quite rightly, I guess, in a lot of ways. Finally, we have with us Mike. Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. And it is snowing in Colchester, or it was. It seems to have stopped. Whether it's now raining is another matter. But yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
All the fun disappears when the rain comes. That's very true. So what drew you to this topic as well, Mike?
Yeah, well, like James, I'm a modern historian rather than early modern. So I'm out of my comfort zone as well in many ways. But I'm fascinated because, as Jo said in her talk, Mary was the first recognized queen. And so as my subject area is women's history in the 20th century, or the early part of the 20th century, I'm kind of fascinated to look at that kind of male-female relationship in terms of power. So I'm particularly fascinated by that, but I'm also interested in the religious aspects as well, in terms of the early Protestant Church of England against Roman Catholic beliefs. So I think that's quite interesting.
Certainly, yeah. And then obviously we've got myself as well, and I just love memory, and I love history, and I mean, there's 6 of us, so there's not time for my questions, but if I could, I'd love to know about Mary in the 19th century, but that's because that's what I do in all my spare time, because I'm that kind of person. So let's move off and let's actually get on to the questions. Let's start to interrogate Jo with all our questions. So I hope that you're all ready to go, historians. We're going to start off with James. I know you got a question. Let's start off with that and kickstart this conversation.
Yeah, so I'm going to build on what I said about kind of like, you know, why Mary's forgotten, why she's not in kind of like the popular collective narrative and such like. As I say, at school, it was all Spanish Armada and, you know, Cardinal Wolsey, and I was bored to death of Cardinal Wolsey. I was desperate to get back to Sherman tanks and all the rest of it. And now, and listening to your talk, there's so much there. It's really like, you know, it's huge. And for 5 years, only 5 years on the throne and everything that went around. I mean, my knowledge of the Tudors, so do forgive me, I probably am the token idiot here, is, you know, a few mini-series and films and a couple of documentaries. It's not, you know, and still I think with the Tudors, the narrative is still, certainly in England, you know, Henry VIII and Elizabeth. And I want to know how that can change. What do you think we can do to get Mary's story out there?
I think the biggest thing that we have to do is like to talk about her reign in as unbiased as we can way. I think that's one of the biggest things is that people hear Mary, and I know we're going to talk about this, I think a little later, but people either go Mary Queen of Scots or they go Bloody Mary. And so there are these two ideas that we have, neither of which are correct. And so I think the biggest thing is that we just have to keep talking about her, and that we have to challenge those traditional views that Mary is either a terrible queen or, well, she would have been good, but she was just a woman and didn't know how to do it. And so that, I guess that tension between can a woman have power and can Mary as a queen have power, which is hard sometimes to reconcile. But I think that the biggest thing in the public frame of mind is that we have to be able to see Mary, which is not always true in heritage sites. It's not always true in galleries. It's not always true in museums. And then we have to start reintroducing Mary as this critical historical figure. Whether you love her or hate her, she is essential to what England and what the UK become.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think, you know, sort of like in school as well. I mean, her story, you know, I mean, with me, it was just a passing by thing. Oh yeah, there was Mary for a brief period and that was it. And, you know, everything was Bloody Mary. It wasn't, you know, all the titles were Bloody Mary. And it's just like, you didn't even think to question it. You know, it was just that stamp that had been put on it. So I guess it's really dealing with that. I mean, whether we rename the cocktail or something, I don't know. But, you know, that title, I mean, I've just asked very, very quickly, how do we get rid of that title, you know?
I think one of the biggest things to get rid of that title is to put it in its context. That by no means am I saying that Mary did not, or I guess that Mary was not at the head of religious persecution in England. That is an unquestionable fact. There were almost 300 Protestants who were burned at the stake during Mary's reign. And burning was just the accepted punishment for heresy. But what's interesting is that Mary becomes this outlier because Edward VI was going to implement burning as a punishment for heresy. But of course, under Edward, the heresy would have been Catholicism. And so under Mary, the heresy becomes Protestantism. And so by not looking at that aspect of Edward's reign, so the king before Mary, we forget that burning is, at the time, an acceptable punishment for religious nonconformity. And then when we get to Elizabeth's reign, we have all of a sudden Catholicism becomes treason. And so Elizabeth doesn't execute Catholics for heresy, she executes them for treason. And so we see this great, oh, well, there was never religious persecution under Elizabeth like there was under Mary. And it's that sense of, well, technically, no, but that's because Elizabeth essentially made Catholicism and outward Catholicism treason. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is to put her back into her context, and that this is not unusual for the time. I'm not saying you should go out and burn people with a stake. Please don't do that.
Disclaimer at the bottom of this.
Not endorsed. But that's normal for the early modern world. And I think the other thing to do to get rid of that name in a more tongue-in-cheek way is to poke fun at it. And I think I warned James and Michael after our talk. We had a little debrief, and I told them I was bringing props.
Ooh.
So shout out to Dan Snow and History Hit for my beautiful new tea towel, which the title on the website was a Bloody Mary tea towel. And of course, I was like, well, I have to see what this is. Like, am I about to get very angry? And so it's, you know, your generic tea towel with Mary. And I thought, this is awful. This is going downhill very quickly. Then I saw the bottom of the tea towel.
Love it.
Where she is holding everything necessary to make the cocktail. And I thought, what a great way to almost discredit, in a way, that nickname.
Totally.
Yeah, that this isn't how she should be remembered. And it brings that name into the public eye, but then also goes, this is ridiculous. We shouldn't be calling her this.
If I'm correct, I mean, I'll just jump in very quickly. I don't think there are many monarchs in English history that have similar titles. Like, Mary is one of the only ones. Obviously, you got Bad King John, so he's called Bad King John. But generally, I can't think of any monarchs who have similar titles. Julie, I think you've got your hand up. Is there anyone that you can
I
think
was
of?
going to ask whether this moniker came around during her lifetime. Was it a Victorian invention? Did it come from Fox? Where did this epithet come from?
So we see in Fox's Acts and Monuments, which is more popularly known as the Book of Martyrs. And so it's a compilation, essentially, of hundreds of stories of persecution and burnings for heresy and in Mary's reign. And it gets published under Elizabeth. And in Acts and Monuments, we see what's described as the bloody time under Mary. And so we have that association of Mary's reign with bloodiness. But it's not, according to one of the historians, it's not until 1658. So that's a full 100 years after Mary has died. So it's not until 1658 that we get that Bloody Mary. And it's not really until Charles II and James II of England, 7th of Scotland. I think that's the right way around, right, Amy? Hopefully. It's not until we get to them that this idea of Bloody Mary really sticks, because there's fears that Charles II is a crypto-Catholic, and this idea that, well, he's going to convert and he's going to bring England back to Catholicism, and how awful would that be? And then he is alleged to have converted on his deathbed to Catholicism. So he dies a Catholic. And then we have James the 7th and 2nd, and he is unapologetically Catholic. That is who he is. He is not changing that for anyone. He doesn't really care that he's head of the Church of England. He's still going to be a Catholic. And so there's a massive fear in both of their reigns that Catholicism is going to come back, and that there's going to be a reliving of the persecution under Mary. And that idea that all of a sudden, well, is the king going to listen to the Pope now? Like, is England now subservient to some foreign power that doesn't know England? And so it's not really until later reigns, and especially until you get to what's called the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when William of Orange and Mary come from what's now the Netherlands, they come to England to be monarchs here, that we really get that sense of Bloody Mary, and that she goes down in history as Bloody Mary altogether.
I see Mike's got his hand up. I'll just say very quickly before Mike jumps in. It's just say May II. She gets forgotten as well, weirdly in history as well. But that's a whole another talk another time. But Mike,
all the Marys.
Yeah, exactly. The name Mary is just apparently tainted in history now. But we'll go to Mike with his question.
Thanks, Michael. Mary, by the way, was my mother's name as well. So just to add to the number of Marys in this picture.
All Marys.
As Joe was talking about the Glorious Revolution, I just thought it was pertinent to think about the relationship between Mary and Philip in the 1550s, and then and how scared the Protestant elite were in terms of Catholicism coming back into a major role in England, and how that was really feared. And then we jump to the Glorious Revolution and the fact that, and I suppose what I was trying to figure through when Joe was talking was whether people feared the Catholicism bit more than the Spanish bit, and how that's then compared with inviting William of Orange, who's not in England, obviously, as Joe's just said, from the Netherlands. And although Mary II is James II's daughter, I think that's right, Joe, and there's a kind of connection there. I was just fascinated with the comparison between Philip II and William of Orange, really, in terms of how they both were viewed.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting comparison, because for all intents and purposes, William of Orange is a foreigner. Yes, he's married to an English heir to the throne, and so becomes quasi-English by association. But he is essentially a foreigner who has been invited to take the throne, which is everything that was feared when Mary's husband, Philip II of Spain, came to marry her, that all of a sudden there is a foreign king who's going to come and he's going to be on the throne, and how terrible is this? But the biggest difference with William of Orange and with Mary is that they're Protestant. And so England has just come out of James II, and the warming pan scandal, which is essentially the only time in English history where the birth of a son has been tragedy for the monarchy. So James II and Mary of Modena have a baby boy. And normally, all of the monarchs are like, I just want a boy, stop giving me girls. But she gives birth to a boy, and all of a sudden, everyone is trying to discredit this child. Because if there's a son, that's the next heir. He's going to be raised Catholic. There's that fear that England is going to descend into Catholic monarchy again. And so the invitation is extended to William and Mary to come to England and to be joint monarchs. Kind of crash course. It is much more nuanced than that. But there's this idea that William and Mary can come and be Protestant, and they can put England back where it's supposed to be. And so there's that idea that, yes, William is foreign, but he's Protestant, and so it's okay, which is not at all how Philip is seen, because there's so much opposition to Philip as Spanish. And that people who oppose the marriage during Mary's reign, the number of people who oppose it is larger in number than the number of Protestants in England. And so we have to see from that, well, it can't be a religious thing, because why would Catholics be opposed to a Catholic? That it doesn't quite add up. And so there's that sense that there has to be an underlying factor of identity, which is at play here. But what also comes into play, as we've said, like Mary II also gets forgotten. Years ago, it's probably more than 10 years, we were at the National Gallery, and I bought, as every monarch-loving child does, the monarchs of England and then of Britain and the UK. And there's a really nice William, and then Anne. Where's Mary? She was a queen. You can't just take her out of this. And so we see that both of the Marys get forgotten in a way. And so one of the revisionist Marian historians has made the argument that Mary I and Mary II are compared because they're both seen as, quote unquote, unnatural, because Mary II has, in some sense, usurped her father's throne if she's accepted this invitation to go and take her father off the throne, which is not what a child should be doing. And then we also get that sense that Mary I doesn't have children, and Mary II leaves the throne essentially when she dies, and then when William dies, they leave the throne to her sister Anne. And so Mary II doesn't leave the throne to her children, or because there are none. And so there's that idea that, well, as women, they have failed because they haven't provided the heir. And so we see that comparison that, yes, Mary II is Protestant, but she's also failed in her main job of providing the heir. And so she gets kind of scratched out of the history books because of that. And William III gets held up because he's a king in a world where we see king, queen, princess.
Can I just ask Joe as well, connected to this, of course, the Netherlands provinces were also the Spanish Netherlands at one point, as I now, didn't the Orange province rebel against that in particular and led other provinces that became what we know now as the Netherlands, and of course the Belgian bit below, which was also originally part of the 19 provinces as I understand it. Was it 19 or 17? I can't remember which. So is there kind of thinking going on that because the Orange, I'm not sure it was led by William or his predecessors, fought against the Spanish and were successful? Is there a connection there as well? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I'm by no means an expert. Michael is frantically signaling that there were 17 provinces. By no means an expert in Dutch history. But I think there is very much this sense that the Netherlands are Spanish originally. They're part of that empire that Spain has. And they rebel for religious and political reasons. And so I think that if I were William and Mary, that would certainly be on my mind as a historically Spanish country, nation, whatever you want to call it in the early modern world. As a formerly Spanish territory, there is that sense that by going to England, you are making that firm break that, Catholicism is not acceptable. The tie of Catholicism to these other world powers is somehow unacceptable. And so I haven't looked too far yet into the thought process behind William and Mary. But if I were them, that would be a thought on my mind, that it's, this is the last decisive break of the Spanish Netherlands, that they are definitively not Catholic and not associated with Spain, who is now, because of the Armada and history, are England's enemies.
Yeah, the link between England and the United Provinces, as it were, is really close. I mean, Elizabeth even sends troops over to the United Provinces to help them fight the Spanish. I mean, the link is there. I mean, even when the Anglo-Dutch Wars happen, people are going, "Why are you fighting the Dutch for? Like, we're buddies, aren't we?" So yes, but I digress. One thing I wanted to, as well, just as a comment, not as a question really, because I know people got other questions and stuff as well. But I wonder about the link between Henrietta Maria, as well, being the Queen consort of to Charles, and her influence being a Catholic monarch as well, and Philip. I wonder if there must be parallels there going on between the two, because people actually, people blame Henrietta Maria, don't they, in the Civil War for all what's going on, and like people probably blame Philip. That's just a comment I have. Sorry, I don't want to digress too much about that Civil War, but it certainly is interesting, isn't it? How you can make these parallels in history like that. Who wants to have the next question?
I can start wrapping up with the last question if you like.
You can do, or does Mike have anything else? I don't know if Mike had anything.
I've got a couple, if that's all right, Amy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's just continue with this religious theme for a little bit. And one of my a question that struck me as Joe was talking on Wednesday was how did Mary reconcile her role as head of the English Church when she was so strongly a Roman Catholic?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting part of Mary's reign. Right at the beginning, of course, Mary succeeds to the throne, and we can talk a little bit about Jane Grey in a second. But she comes to the throne as the head of the Church of England, which is anathema to everything that Mary believes. A woman should not be the head of the church. There should not be a Church of England because the Pope is the head of the capital C church. But in order for Mary to hand that authority back to the Pope, she has to act as head of the church to give the power back, which is really interesting because when she comes to the throne, there's a very clear division that England will return to Catholicism, but there will not be papal authority. And so there's that new Catholicism, as some academics have put it, that Mary really leads the Catholic Counter-Reformation before that's really a thing, because she takes this idea of a national church and she accepts that there will be a Catholic church in England, and that in England it will be different than in France or in Italy or the Vatican, that it will be a different kind of Catholicism. But in order to do that, she has to step into her role as head of the Church of England and make that change. So she takes this power that she does not like and does not want and uses it to give away that power, which is really interesting because she has to, in a way, become what she doesn't want to be and what she sees as the problem with Christianity in the early modern English world. And she has to use that to make changes. So it's a really interesting view that almost the end justifies the means, to put a very Machiavellian spin on it, that she doesn't want to be the head of the church, but if being head of the church means that she can bring Catholicism back to England, then she'll do it.
So that's a really interesting thought, which I hadn't never come across before, the fact that Mary's thinking that we can bring back Catholicism, but in a different way. And that then, I mean, it's almost like Greek Orthodoxy, isn't it, or Russian Orthodoxy, that, you know, that doesn't recognize Rome as the dominant bit of Catholicism, and because as a Roman Catholic, you have to, as I understand it, and I was brought up as a Roman Catholic, I'm no longer, but you have to accept papal infallibility, as I understand it, and so that concept of recognizing or not recognizing the Pope is really, really interesting, actually. But
it highlights, doesn't it? Just, I think, the big changes that, you know, when Henry VIII changed the Church of England, just how deep-rooted these changes really affected England and would affect England for forever, really. And the difficulties it would be, even if Catholicism came back to England, that it wouldn't be the same, because the change was so big and so drastic, that it'd be very hard to make it as it was. I think that's an interesting point, and Mary had to deal with that. She had to kind of put herself in that place and quite cleverly actually think about it, a way around that, I think, which shows that, you know, shows her dealing with all these kind of complexities, because I don't think, especially in the 21st century, we don't always understand the complex nature properly of this. And it wasn't it, Joe? It was very complex.
Yeah, absolutely. And as one of the questions and comments we unfortunately didn't get to in the first talk on Wednesday was Neil Carey, I think is who said this. That's what I wrote down. So hopefully he's listening. That he said it's really a comment on Mary's ability as a queen, that she comes to the throne and has this idea that this is how she wishes England was. But she knows enough, undoing the Reformation will not work. It's almost too far gone to be entirely undone. But she knows that there are some things that she can change. And so I think that's really the hallmark of a leader who knows their people, is that, yes, Protestantism wasn't inevitable in England in 1553 when Mary comes to the throne, but it's also not inevitable that Catholicism will come back. And so Mary stands in this very awkward middle ground, almost, that she knows undoing the Reformation isn't going to work, and that undoing that means giving back all sorts of property that the crown has that was monasteries, and it's not feasible in a way, if that makes sense.
No, 100%. Judy, do you have one more question for Joe before we go on to Amy? You're muted, by the way. Just as a comment there.
Sorry, I'm on my mobile, so I can't quite tell what's what. There was something I really wanted to mention was, and it might be a bit left field, but when I was watching the talk, which I absolutely adored, the thing that struck me was the effigy that you displayed a picture of this effigy, the funeral effigy, naked, swollen, middle-aged woman's body, and it seemed almost indecent in this exposure, and I felt that it seemed the ultimate indignity to a virtually forgotten or misunderstood queen. And I was wondering if you could tell me anything about this effigy, and why it's ended up in this undignified state. I understood that effigies were carried on the coffins during the funeral, and I wondered what happened to them afterwards. Obviously, Elizabeth's tomb has a massive stone effigy on top, and her sister has no discernible marking. I was just wondering if you could tell me anything about that.
Yeah, so there's, not to get super technical and lose all of our viewers who have watched to this point, but there is a theory in monarchical history of the king or queen's two bodies. So there's this political body that is the crown, and the crown never dies. And then there's this personal body, which is, in Mary's case, the woman who maybe wakes up and goes, I just want to sleep in for 5 more minutes, but she can't. Or the woman who goes, I just want to have the perfect wedding and people don't like who I've chosen. So when Mary dies, there's this awkward few months before Elizabeth I is crowned where the personal body of the monarch is dead. And Elizabeth takes over that role of the personal body of the monarch. But until Elizabeth is crowned and anointed, Mary is still the crown. And so when she dies, food is still brought to her chambers because the queen is not dead. That, the capital TQ, the queen is not dead. And so they still bring her food. They still curtsy or show the proper respect to the empty throne because the crown is not dead. And so we see this awkward until Elizabeth comes in and takes over that role. Mary is the queen. And so until Mary is buried and the rods of staff are broken and put into her tomb, Mary is still the queen, even though Elizabeth holds that place. So there's this awkward moment for a while. And so this effigy is a massive part of that because as it's processing on top of or near the coffin of the personal body of the monarch, there's this political body that is the effigy. And so it's dressed in all sorts of clothing that is fit for a queen. And when Mary is buried, it loses all of its power because Mary is buried, the rods of staff are broken, Elizabeth is now queen, and that will be confirmed when she is crowned and anointed. And so this effigy has this massive significance in that procession. And as soon as Mary is buried, though, it becomes something that you can pay a penny for and go see in an exhibit. In much the same way that, you pay to go to Westminster Abbey now, and you pay your extra £5 and you can go up to the Queen's Diamond Jubilee galleries. That's how people would have done it in the early modern world as well. You pay your money and you go and essentially you gawk at the effigies of previous monarchs. And it would have presumably been clothed at the time. And I think Amy knows a little bit more about this based on her research into Anne of Denmark, which is James VI and First's wife. Because her effigy, I believe, is also there and is also naked. And it's unfortunately just part of how they've been preserved and conserved and remembered, that they unfortunately don't have the clothing that some of the more recent, relatively speaking, monarchs have. So you'll go in and you will see the beautiful outfits on some of the other effigies. And that just isn't there for some of the late medieval and early modern ones, simply because of age and because of kind of outside factors in how they were stored and maintained in the early modern world. And there's that tension in the preservation heritage side of, you know, I want her to have nice clothes. I want her to look like the queen. But then that, in a sense, is not doing justice to how she's been remembered up to this point. And we see that, I think, a lot in conservation and restoration work. And there's the chair at Winchester Cathedral, which Mary is alleged to have used in the wedding. And just because of age, because of external factors, it's not in perfect shape. I mean, it's amazing that anything is from 500 years ago. And so that issue is they have to conserve it. And so, you know, you don't reupholster it because that's taking away the history, but you also want to preserve it so it doesn't get worse. And I think that's the awkward stage that the effigy is in, that we want to clothe her because we want, it's not COVID, I promise. It's probably the most I've spoken in ages. That we want to see her as the queen that she was, but we also don't want to change the history and everything that comes with it of how she's presented.
So it's not a deliberate slight of any sort. It's purely the effects of age. I saw, I did a little bit of research before this, and I saw that in the galleries that they've been very excited when they've been doing the preparation for the exhibition, that they discovered some of the garments had 1930s Sketchley dry cleaning labels in them, which amused me enormously because, you know, you got visions of some perfunctory guy from the Abbey sort of trotting down to the dry cleaners with this bag of stuff. Please.
That'd be hilarious. If only there was a camera that could take a photo of that moment.
Just trotting down like 300-year-old things.
Yeah. Nothing to see here, guys.
The dry cleaner said, yeah, we'll take absolute care of them. And they all came back with beautifully stitched little labels in them, you know.
I love it.
I think that space, just to jump in there, I think that space is really wonderful. Joe and I went literally the week before lockdown number 1. And yeah, the effigies just made us like, oh, it was amazing. But yeah, one of the things that we noticed with Mary's one is, like you were saying, Julie, because of like the middle-aged body, is that her stomach's quite round, and we were wondering whether there's anything about pregnancies there, and we got very excited. So one day Joe and I can go back and do some more.
Put me in mind a bit of if you go to St. Peter's Basilica, there are effigies of the popes, and you know, I like this idea of the power that's imbued in this body, representative of the, you know, the power of the notion of the state rather than the notion of the human person. So yeah, I find that very powerful, actually.
I remember
it. Do they still do it? When did it stop? Do you know? Don't know.
Unfortunately, I don't. I think now the custom is to have the draping of the flag and the state funeral as opposed to the effigy.
And of course, we have photographs and pictures now where they didn't before. They didn't have something that would show the corporeal nature of the person.
Where's our modern historians? You know, James and Mike. This is your domain, surely. No, I jest. Let's just go to our I'll ask you questions from Amy, just so we give Joe a bit of rest. So Amy, what questions do you have to ask?
And so really, I just wanted to wrap up with a few questions for Jo about where else is Mary actually remembered, whether that's negative or positively, and where are other spaces that she's not remembered that she really should be, that she is part of that site's narrative so much that it's kind of ridiculous that she's not there.
Yeah, there are a few, and unfortunately some of them are the big fish of the heritage world. So I guess we'll start with the iffy ones so that, we can go to the positive ones. So in the pre-lockdown world, when we could still go places and weren't concerned that we were on packed trains, I was at Hampton Court. And the way that she is just missing is really powerful to me. That she's glossed over in the 5-minute introduction to the Tudors. And the video goes, after Edward was Mary, and then Elizabeth. And then it talked about Elizabeth. And that's the only 5-second thing to know that there was someone between the two. And then in the portion where they get to Henry VIII's heirs, there's a portrait of Edward. Fine. He's the son. That's acceptable. There's Elizabeth. Okay. Also Henry's child. This is also fair. And then there's Anne Boleyn. She's not an heir, but there's no portrait of Mary. And so there's that sense of, what are you doing? Of, this is a spot where Mary should be. You don't have to kind of get into that religious debate, which I think is part of why so many sites don't want to talk about her, because she is such a divisive figure. But the more we don't talk about her, the more she becomes divisive because people don't know differently. And so she's obviously left out at Hampton Court, which plays a major factor in her life. And when she gets married at Winchester Cathedral, there's nothing at the cathedral that proclaims that. You almost have to know that this happened and ask the right questions, or a guide might tell you. But if you go in and don't take a guided tour, you're not going to know. And then we look at Wolvesey Castle, which is kind of behind the cathedral in Winchester, which is where Mary stayed in the days around her wedding. And there's nothing on the interpretation plaques there that say anything. If you go on the website, it says a little bit, but there's nothing. If you're at the site and go, oh, that's cool, but aren't, interested enough to go and read more, you would never know. And I think that's kind of mirrored in a good way. It's mirrored by some of the sites that are doing it really well and who are dedicated to preserving this image of Mary. And one of the massive ones that one day when this lockdown is over and we can travel again, I would like to go to Framlingham, because that is where Mary raised her troops. When Jane Grey was briefly on the throne and Mary went, that is mine, please get off of it. And she raises her troops to essentially go and take the capital by force. And she raises them at Framlingham. And that's one of the sites where Mary isn't forgotten. She's a massive part of that history. Obviously not the only history of the site, but she's remembered there. And I think that's a massive step, that she is part of this heritage site and of a well-known heritage site. And so I think it's really essential that, that get raised up, and they're doing a great job. And that maybe sites like Wolvesey, like the cathedral, like Winchester Cathedral, like Westminster Abbey, could put something, just to say that this is part of the history. And it's a contested history, that's for sure. But it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it.
Yeah, I think just two random things to pull out from that. Firstly, I think the chair's no longer on display, is it? But I think it used to be. I'm sure it was in when I did the role that you do. I'm sure that it was there. And I do not remember the interpretation because this was like 10 years ago. But it strikes me as, you know, they redid that entire space and it was kind of like, well, do we need Mary? No, we don't. It's fine. Because she was there. She was present.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that the way that has been chosen to interpret that history is there's the Kings and Scribes exhibition, which has history from, you know, the conquest from before 1066 to Charles II and this new organ. But Mary's missing. And you go, but she's a queen, but for all intents and purposes, she's a king. Let's put her there. And this idea that, yes, the chair needs some serious work to preserve it, but that, you know, there aren't massive fundraising appeals happening. And I, as a student, certainly do not have the money to just go, take it. Yeah, so that's one thing. I think, Julie, you have thoughts on this?
Jo, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to ask, do you think it's because she has this unpopular legacy? Do you think it's this whole Bloody Mary thing? They want to step away from it. It's uncomfortable history. It's awkward. It's, you know, that they feel there isn't the appetite to revisit these kind of awkward stories.
Yeah, I think part of it is like they have this piece of history, but then the awkward thing, and I find that even when I explain to people what my research is, and there's that immediate, oh, that's really cool. Like, we really need that. Or, well, she's just Bloody Mary. And so how do you start to write interpretation texts to go next to her chair? How do you write that? And I think I know how I would write it. But then when the public is involved, people have opinions, which is fair. Mm-hmm. And there will be a lot of kickback of this isn't good enough, or you're doing it wrong. Like, she was a terrible person. Do you mean that it's okay to go and persecute people? And so I think part of it is that she has this afterlife that is so divisive and it overshadows the history part. And so I think some of it is like that relative that you invite to Christmas, but you don't really want to be there. She's kind of that relative, it seems, in the heritage world of, like, we have to address it because she's important, but how do we do that? And how do we do that the public doesn't then get upset and go, well, you're condoning religious violence?
Mike, did you have something to say, Mike?
Just reflecting on Jules' question about memory, and I just want to go just highlight William the Conqueror, but wasn't he also known William the Bastard as well? And you know, there was a possible claim of genocide during his reign, of lots and lots of people being murdered, or I don't know what the right word is, but certainly there was huge loss of life during his reign. So, but we tend to forget that as well, don't we? And then I just wonder here, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as a kind of looking at women's history, the gender difference between the first queen, if you like, and the male monarchs, perhaps. Maybe that's just a question mark we should leave hanging in the balance there.
Yeah. And to build on that a little bit, James had been, before we hit record, was asking about Lady Jane Grey. And so she is briefly on the throne for about 12 days. She is the 9-day queen because for 3 of those days, it was under wraps that Edward VI was dead. So it was only known to a few people. And so by the time she's announced as queen and she's deposed as queen, it's 9 days. But she is portrayed in the historical narrative as oh, well, she was married off to Guilford Dudley at a young age, and oh, like it was all her parents' fault, and she's not responsible, and she's just the victim of circumstances. And it's very unempowering in a way that, yes, this in no way, Lady Jane Grey never went, I want to be queen. But she held her own. And that's not the image that has come down to us, because we have this view of Mary and Jane, where Mary is the woman who takes on a traditionally masculine gender role of power, and she is criticized for it. And then we have Jane, who has been transformed into this perfect, ideal Victorian woman who does what her father says and does what her husband says and is influenced by those around her. And we have, James had said, and I went to go get it because who doesn't love props? We have the, so the Delaroche painting of the execution of Lady Jane Grey from 1833. And we have this woman in, I know the glare is kind of bad. It's finally sunny here. But we have in the middle Jane Grey in a pure white gown with a white blindfold being helplessly led to the scaffold, which is partly true. When they put the blindfold on, she did get a little confused and couldn't find the block. But the white just makes her seem like this innocent, virginal woman who's being executed for no reason. And so we see her as, the perfect woman who's just been torn down by everyone around her. And the interesting part of that is when we look at it from that gendered perspective, there's so much more going on. We see, 500 years since Mary and the evolution of gender roles, that a woman in power is maligned, but Jane as a woman who goes, oh, I don't want power, but don't give it to my husband though, that she is this proto-feminist, but also ideal subservient woman, which is, that doesn't do Jane justice either. And so gender plays a massive role in how they're remembered and portrayed and how we, as the public, look at them from a distance.
Just as a comment as well, that painting in 1833, you said, this is the whole, when the Catholic Emancipation Act's been debated massively in Victorian England, isn't it, as well? So it's this something that I study, which is the idea of a usable past as well. That certain pasts are usable, certain pasts aren't usable, and I think Mary is usable in Victorian England and maybe in the present day, perhaps even to a certain degree, maybe of almost is used in the argument of tyranny, isn't it, and things like that in public imagery and mindset, and which is problematic, and it's problematic. And I think usable pasts and how we see history does need to be reinterpreted and re-looked at. And this is a thing. It's something that I'm doing my research, is that whole idea of usable history. And I think Mary is, we talked about earlier, didn't we, about why isn't Mary at certain places and certain sites? It's because of that struggle of usable. Can she be usable? Is she usable? And I think the answer is yes, she is. But it's this struggle with that. I think that's the thing that I notice anyway, as someone who looks at this too much.
It's that old problem in heritage sites in particular, that they choose a story they want to tell and then they forget or leave out the ones that don't fit.
Yeah.
The authorised heritage discourse. It's a very tricky matter.
Yeah, I'll let James jump in a second because I can see James branching. But Julie just touched on something I was actually going to say, which was about how, so with the English heritage sites, Joe said that, they're doing a great job at Framingham, but not at the Castle in Winchester. And there's a difference there in terms of how the two sites are run, one being a paying site and one being a free site that you can just go into, and the free sites having less investment. So I know like the Framlingham interpretation has been updated a lot more recently than the Castle's interpretation in Winchester, and that sense that even though that's still created by an English Heritage interpretation team, they've been done to last for a long time in comparison to a paid site where you can renew it a bit more often. And also something that the English Heritage do, which is they say, we're going to pick a theme, a time period, and like Julie was saying, this is the time period for this site, even if this site has been here for 1,000 years, and we won't deviate from that discussion. So if they've picked the Winchester Castle to be, this is going to be really medieval, then they'll keep it really medieval. And then if they've gone, let's be more early modern and Tudor with Framlingham, then that is what they will do. So
I'll let James come in now. I was going to say something, but James, go on. You can come in.
I was going to interrupt you, James, and then I was like, oh no, I've got to get in here.
No, I was just going to make a very quick question about the painting coming out in 1833. Well, who comes on the throne 3 years later? Victoria. And what Michael said about Victorian imagery, I just think that painting carries more legacy because it's about that idea of womanhood and Victorian womanhood. But I will pass on to Michael.
Well,
yeah, and this idea that Victoria comes to the throne as this, pure young woman, and then to have way more children than I want to imagine. And there's that idea that she somehow is the perfect wife and mother, but is also a queen. And so this almost is the precursor to how do we deal with traditional gender roles when the gender roles are swapped, and how do we do that?
Victoria is a successful, fertile queen, which we hadn't had, and herself didn't have any children, or she had lots of children, but none of them survived. So Victoria's that perfect queen in that she does exactly what's expected and populates the royal families of Europe for the next 100 years.
The painting that James said as well, I mean, it tells us more about the Victorian time than it does anything else. And this is the thing about paintings, is that because those watching or listening to this, it's always good to know is that when you read a painting or you look at a painting, know that it tells you more about the artist's time than it does actually about the event. And I think that's a crucial thing that people need to know a bit more, because the romantic imagery does come to us a lot in a lot of ways, and it's always important to understand that. Same with films. That goes the same with films. Films tell us more about our own time than actually the event. And there's a comment about buildings telling us, English heritage, and buildings telling us one story that they want to tell in that story. One time period. That even goes for towns. I mean, you take I use culture as an example just because I know it, but the Roman history, Roman story, that's what we're gonna tell. Everything else comes second, third to this. This is what we tell. And other histories get forgotten or get put down because they aren't sellable or doesn't fit with that narrative of Roman history or of progress and stuff. And I think that's where a lot of histories, and not only Mary, but a lot of histories do get lost because they don't fit into this narrative that is built, and whether it's Roman, whether it's Norman, whether it's Victorian. Some of these narratives don't get to see the light of day, which is really sad, and hurts me a lot with the Civil War. But there we go.
Yeah. And what's interesting is we see sometimes there are historical figures who don't fit the narrative. Mike was talking, I think maybe before we hit record, about Byrd and Tallis, who were two huge composers of the Elizabethan age, to the point that if you go to kind of a high Anglican service that is sung, it's probably going to be music that was made by Tallis. Like, he is still the name of choral church services. And they're both Catholic. But so they don't fit this narrative of a Protestant or a Reformed Church of England. And yet they're the ones writing the church music. They're the ones who are given permission to do the church music by Elizabeth, who at this point is cracking down on recusants, so on people who are Catholic and who practice their Catholicism kind of covertly. So she's cracking down on Catholicism and yet is building up these men, even though they're Catholic, because they're quiet about it. And so you can almost separate them from their narrative. They don't fit the narrative, but if we brush out the things that don't fit, that's fine. We can put them back in. And I think what we forget so often is, I believe it's Bird, writes a poem, a song, however you want to phrase that, a lyrical piece of work that is about Mary's, the first's tomb. And it talks about how she's been forgotten, but fortune remembers her, but she hasn't been given the tomb that she deserves. So it's a really interesting one. It's in the British Library if they open and if we're ever allowed to go back. It's crowned with lilies, I believe, and flowers. And it's a whole piece about how Mary has been forgotten and how that isn't right and it isn't fair. And yet, he's still a massive part of church history in England, which is really interesting that, we've been able to whitewash away the things that don't fit the narrative, and they can be put back in without these little strings that make them complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope that one day we can actually have, because I think a lot of history has been forgotten in England, and I really hope one day we can actually get a lot of it back into our national story, because it's stuff that, even if it's stuff, wherever it could be, it's only useful for us to learn from. I honestly think that to a point anyway, but that's just me being maybe a romantic of a historian. That's my romantic side of me coming out. We should probably wrap this up because we've been here for a long time, but James, I see you, and do you know what? I'm going to you know. Here you go, James. Have your time. Go on.
Just want to ask a very, very quick question. Obviously, the work of Mary is going to be written by Dr. Strong in X amount of years' time when she's done her research and she's finished. But if we are someone who isn't familiar with the period, maybe, interested in a different period and wants to know more, would you recommend any reading?
Well, I have a whole bookshelf of reading. I'm like eyeing names to make sure I get them right. So the massive leaders of the field are Sarah Duncan, who talks about Mary's gender and how the gender fits into ceremony and power. There is Susan Doran and Thomas Freeman, who have written a groundbreaking work which puts together the old perspectives of Mary and the new perspectives. And there's Anna Whitelock, who has done a lot of stuff. There's Valerie Chute, who is, I think, one of the historians. She's done so much to put Mary back into perspective and to put her back into context and to put her in relation to Elizabeth in more than just, here's Mary, here's Elizabeth, Elizabeth was better. Is she looks at it from, okay, well, let's look at it on an even keel. We're going to hang up and I'm going to think of so many other names.
No, that's a good start. Thank you. That's a really good start. Thanks.
Yeah, 100%. And some really good, said some really good stories there. So if you're listening to this or watching this, do go check those ones out. I won't repeat them because you can easily just reverse and just listen to those again. But definitely worth a read. Thank you, James, for that question. That's a good question to ask. Well, we will leave it there because we could go on for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of things about Mary that we haven't talked about today. And there's a lot about a character that, is really interesting and wish we could talk about her reign and things happened in her reign. But that's maybe I'll talk for another time, perhaps. It's actually about, the reign itself. But thank you so much, Joe, for that talk. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone here really enjoyed it. Otherwise they wouldn't be here. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, everyone, for being here, asking your questions. It was great to hear from each and every one of you. And it's great to have those conversations as well. And as someone who's interested in memory, I was loving it. So I will just say thank you for watching. Thank you very much for spending your time listening to us talk about history. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Do subscribe. Do follow us on the podcast service if you're listening to that. And stay tuned for more stuff because we've got more stuff coming out weekly, and we hope that you will enjoy. So once again, thank you from all those from us at History Indoors, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.